After 9 years of coalition rule, Australia voted Labor into office. Now, Labor's victory should also bring with it a change in foreign policy, not only in how it deals with domestic issues, but how it will deal with China and Taiwan, China and the Solomon Islands, and the Russia-Ukraine war, and what it will do to restore its international reputation, which many claim has taken a beating under the former Morrison government. Well, joining us today to discuss these very important issues is Australia's leading foreign policy expert and professor at Deakin University, Greg Barton. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you. Good to be with you. I don't know about leading expert, but I'm happy to chat. Interesting.
Well, you're our leading expert, Greg, at the Informer.
Well, I'm glad to be talking to you about these things. It is, I think we are in an interesting moment where things are going to change. On the one hand, foreign policy doesn't change quickly. And in Australia in particular, there's not a big difference in actual policy between the Liberal National Party and the Labor Party. But in practice, in 2022, it is going to be very different. Not because on paper policy changes, but attitude changes, personnel changes, energy changes, priorities change. And I think we saw a preview of that with the Quad meeting in Tokyo this week, flagging that responding to climate change is a big priority, engaging with the South Pacific, on climate change and other matters. The fact we've got an Asian Australian foreign minister, it's good that for the third time in a row, we have a female foreign minister, but an Asian Australian foreign minister sends a strong message as well, particularly when she's so articulate and formidable. All of that, I think also in a context where China was looking for a chance to reset. Any change of government gives a chance to reset, and this particular government coming in, I think, has some good opportunities as well as some enormous challenges.
Now, in the campaign, the Labor Party was very big on characterising the Solomon Islands of Morrison being asleep at the wheel and letting it happen. But just today, we've seen China going into 10 Pacific Island nations with a fairly concise and complete plan. Would that have happened with the Morrison government in there as well, do you think, or is this a test?
I think it was planned well ahead of our election result being known. So I think it would have happened regardless. I think, we've got to, as a footnote, separate out campaign rhetoric and language from what people actually believe. So we had some pretty unpleasant party politic employment of security and China in particular in the campaign, which wasn't helpful, was not particularly wise. The reality is Labor and Liberal are on the same page as far as the key issues on China. It's just that this new government's in a position to start talking with China in a different sort of way. So I don't think that on the Liberal side they really believed that Labor would be soft on China, but it was a campaign slogan. And Labor has probably over-egged things a bit in saying that we were completely asleep at the wheel in the South Pacific and we're trying. It's interesting, though, that there are some stories coming out that Marise Payne was lobbying for us to do more, and within her own party, she was held back and didn't win that argument. So, there's probably something in that we'll hear about. We do need to do more in the South Pacific, no question. We've done a lot. We didn't ever let it go, but we probably missed some opportunities to do things at a critical time.
Now, the climate change has been pointed out as probably one of the greatest security threats for the lower-lying nations. China, being one of the world's biggest emitters, doesn't seem to be congruent with the climate change threat that they're facing, does it, Greg?
Yeah, it's all about expectations. So you expect more of certain partners and friends than you do of people that you sort of cast in a different way. So I think, and I'm just speculating here on the view from the South Pacific, but the South Pacific expects a heck of a lot from Australia and New Zealand and other Western friends. It knows China is China. So to the extent China gets some inroads in the South Pacific, it's going to be because it's convenient money and opportunity, whether at an individual level in a way that, frankly, is not healthy politics, or whether because China is actually offering something substantial at a national level. Expectations of Chinese behaviour are different than expectations of Australian behaviour. So it was very, very disappointing for Australians, but certainly for people in the South Pacific, that Australia was not trying harder in transitioning to a post-carbon economy and reducing greenhouse emissions, particularly over this critical decade through to 2030. The previous government just didn't seem to understand the urgency, and some within the party didn't even believe it. We've still got sort of statements and the likes of Matt Canavan on the national side saying net zero is finished, don't worry about it. There's a lot of inconsistency. So people in the South Pacific, people all around the world, expect more of Australia as a progressive, wealthy Western democracy. They know that China, there's a lot of things they could say about China, but they can't change China in the way they might be asked to change. But there's another sort of level of complexity to this, and that is that if we are to end up in 2030 in a better position than we've been on track these last few years, and of solar panels, photovoltaics on domestic groups, but that was largely consumers voting with their feet. Just as we saw the election results coming in on Saturday night from the federal election, individuals make their own choices, whether because of conviction or because of economics or both. And I think the Australian public, in the way it voted, but also doing things like installing solar panels, has been ahead of where political leadership has been. So there's reason for hope there. China, yes, is sort of a third of the problem, or at least 30% of the problem. But China leads on the production of photovoltaics and battery technology. China, the government in Beijing is well aware that its citizens are being poisoned by the toxic vapors of urban environments from diesel fumes and coal power stations, etc. They want to move away from it. I mean, they can't do miracles, but there's pressure politically, there's pressure economically in terms of energy security to move away from fossil fuels. And they have the technology at scale to make it happen. I mean, the photovoltaic story, of course, is, a lot of key developments were done in Australia, but commercialized in China. That is what it is. So China has to be part of the solution. And us being able to talk in Australia with counterparts in China and get back to a more healthy relationship is good all around, not least on this question of mitigating climate change.
Now, how does Australia counteract China's march into the Pacific, and what part will the Quad play in that counteracting?
I think we've got to see this as a long-term play. China plays the long game decades in advance. One of the reasons we're so concerned about what could happen over this coming decade in the South Pacific is we see what happened over the last decade in the South China Sea. China went in with a fair degree of chutzpah when we were preoccupied with wars in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, and claimed atolls and tidal islands as being Chinese territory, and then did remarkable things in transforming them into military bases, 2 large installations in Spratlys in particular. And that's now a fait accompli. We can grumble and we can stamp our feet, but we're not going to change that. The Quad put out a statement last year about freedom of navigation with respect to the South China Sea, and so the Quad is going to push back on that. We can't make those Chinese bases in the South China Sea go away. China's not about to build the same sort of bases in the Solomon Islands or New Guinea or anywhere else in the Pacific on the same scale, but it wants to have options. It wants to have options for dual-use facilities, long airstrips, long docks that can service military hardware, and it wants to have the commercial agreements in place and the political agreements in place so that if push came to shove, and of course the push and the shove on the horizon is Xi Jinping saying he will reunify Taiwan with the mainland during his tenure in office. He's about to get another 5-year term this November, may go beyond that. The calculation seems to be that China recognizes it needs another 5 or 10 years to be confident about being able to pull off a military invasion of Taiwan. It's no doubt been given pause for thought by the Russian failure in Ukraine. But at least as long as Xi Jinping is there, his rhetoric says he wants to do this. What we want to try and do is discourage China by making it look too hard and too difficult and too risky. but that seems a long way from the South Pacific. But the point is, Chinese military actions across the Taiwan Straits, Joe Biden has just reaffirmed will elicit an American response, and that invariably means an Australian response as well in some form. And it's likely to go well beyond just the Taiwan Straits. It's likely to involve broader maneuvers and jostling, and the South Pacific may well be a factor. I mean, if the Chinese could quickly transition to having a major military presence in the Solomon Islands whilst they're engaged in operations across the Taiwan Straits, that changes the calculus in the way that we're distracted and our resources are diverted. It's pretty consequential. So it's a long, I mean, that's not that far off potentially, but going decades forward, if we got to 2040 and looked back and said, well, our first nuclear submarines are about to arrive, they're just about to come, but China has dual use facilities across the South Pacific. In fact, to use the language of Beijing, it has this chain of islands, starting with Taiwan and going all the way through, ending up in the South Pacific. And it's now got a blue water navy, and it's got the technology and the resources to be a challenge to anyone, including the US. We would be ruining the day that we allow them to get easy wins in the South Pacific. So it's a long play.
Yeah. Now, do you think, what signs should we look for, Greg? Do you think we'll see a thawing of the mood at the moment between China and Australia first? Will we see a genuine reconciliation, removal of any of the sanctions that we've got? What are we looking for here? What will give us a sign?
I think when we start having person-to-person communications at a senior level, it's interesting that Li Keqiang, the Premier, reached out and congratulated Anthony Albanese on becoming Prime Minister. Albanese sort of batted that away in public a little. He said, I'll respond when I get back to Canberra. He was in Tokyo at the time. But it's sort of an encouraging sign, potentially. The fact, or put it this way, since 2019, there's not been any ministerial level contacts with the Chinese. They're just not answering our calls. They're not talking to us. They've frozen us out, sending a message. Presumably it was not intended to be forever, but it was sending a message to the Morrison government. They're clearly looking at an Albanese government and thinking this is an opportunity to start normal communications again. So seeing that sort of ministerial level senior communiques will be really important. No one pretends it's going to be easy. And, Albanese, I think quite correctly pointed out that he's not going to be any more soft on China than the Morrison government was. But there will be more capacity to engage. And the fact we've got a new team in town gives an opportunity for that reset.
Great. All right, Professor Greg Barton, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure. Great to be with you again. Thanks.